Thank you so much, Jeff. It really is wonderful to be back and to see so many of you again. And as you've heard, one of the most important words that Jeff just uttered was love. And I think that if we had more love in the world today, a lot of our problems would be more easily solved. So the goal of my talk is really to frame human health in the context of the interconnected grand challenges and to recognise particularly that immune health reflects the declining health and disruption of ecosystems at all scale. I'm going to talk as an immunologist about inflammation as a growing biological threat, but also a metaphor for the mounting social and environmental challenges that we're facing. And you're going to hear many common themes that reflect what we've heard already today, but I'm going to be coming at this from a developmental perspective as a paediatrician. And all that I'm going to be saying is looking at how our vulnerability to non-communicable diseases in general reflects the declining physical, social, emotional and spiritual environment. Our personal, physical, emotional and spiritual health cannot be separated from the physical and emotional and spiritual health of our societies and on the attitudes that we have towards each other and our natural environment. So I'm going to also be talking about the need for more imaginative, integrated solutions and the deeper values that unite and empower and refocus priorities of individuals and societies towards healthier futures. And this community, of course, needs no introduction to planetary health. But I did want to draw your attention to a paper that we recently wrote last year, Exiting the Anthropocene, Achieving Personal and Planetary Health in the 21st Century, because this paper really underscores the links between personal and immune ecology in particular and the wider planetary health agenda. Planetary health, of course, it must be acknowledged, is not a new concept. This is inherent to Indigenous cultures for centuries. To harm the earth is to harm the self. But this really entered the mainstream Western discourse more in the 1960s, and our planetary consciousness was really evoked by the Earthrise photograph in 1986. And that culminated, of course, in the first Earth Day in 1970, where we heard these early calls for integrated perspectives that recognise the connections between individuals, communities, environment, and planetary systems. And we saw throughout the 1970s and 80s the expansion of more integrated, holistic approaches to human and environmental health. But this still remained largely outside the mainstream discourse. Of course, this community was well acquainted with all of these philosophies, but we did review this recently in Explore. It wasn't until really 2015 that the concept of planetary health was established in the mainstream medical lexicon. The totality of health should be viewed through this broader banner. And that led to the establishment of a number of global interdisciplinary planetary health networks, of which the Planetary Health Alliance is the main one of these, and that's a consortium of over 360 universities. And the network that I lead, the NOVA network, which is part of the Planetary Health Alliance as well. And we're really about promoting this planetary health discourse as an overarching framework of connectivity for integrated solutions. It's really about promoting awareness that the Anthropocene has been a period of profound ecological imbalance affecting society on all levels, from biodiversity loss right through to the massive social unrest that we're experiencing now. And the declining human health really reflects ecosystems disruption on all of these scales, from our physical, emotional, social, economic, political, and spiritual climate, all from the first moments of life. Even before the COVID-19 pandemic, we were, of course, experiencing a pandemic of non-communicable diseases, which were inextricably linked to erosion of all of these interdependent ecosystems. And this pandemic, of course, had been evolving in slow motion for decades and closely parallels the declining erosion of the environmental change at both the macro and the micro scales. So planetary health is really concerned with far more than climate change and biodiversity loss. It really spans all of these systems on all scales, from the largest to the smallest, recognising that these are all interconnected and interdependent. So as clinicians, we often focus on the inner circle of this diagram, the impact of these factors from food, tobacco, water and so on our personal ecology from the first moments of life. But we really need to pay more attention to the dark blue ring, the bidirectional influences, the human-made systems that include our economic, political and cultural value systems, which influence both our personal risk factors, but also increasingly our planetary systems. This, of course, also provides a unifying model for flourishing on all scales. Flourishing of individuals, mind, body, spirit, depends on flourishing places and communities. And that, of course, depends on the values, the mindsets, the policies that support this, that support flourishing communities and planetary systems. This all requires a cultural change, essentially. We need kinder and more integrated approaches and mindsets. So the planetary health framework is much more than an eco-biological perspective. It really speaks to the emotional and spiritual bonds between person and place, the stories that speak to the heart as much as the intellect. And I draw your attention to the Planetary Health Pledge, because we feel that healthcare professionals have a really important role to play in promoting the planetary health concepts. I won't go through this, but that was published in The Lancet in 2020. So there is a direct line from planetary to personal ecology, and the immune interface is a really important part of that story. It describes how adverse macro-scale ecology penetrates to the molecular level, including the microbial systems at the foundation, not just of our ecosystems, but of all ecosystems. And we can see that the drivers of inflammation and dysbiosis echo across every level, from the cellular burden that we've been hearing about to the environmental burden at the macro scale. They are the same factors. And they impact immune system as a mediator of the multi-system health consequences that we've been describing. And this audience, of course, is very familiar with the role of inflammation as a slow and silent killer, as one of the most significant risk factors for non-communicable diseases and all-cause mortality, highlighting once again the central role of the immune system. But these concepts are actually relatively recent. And it just takes me back to my own career story. In the mid-1980s, when I began my research career, some of these concepts were actually quite new. That I was working in a cardiovascular research group, and it was just dawning in mainstream awareness that cardiometabolic diseases may be more, or rather that cardiovascular disease was more than just narrowed calcified vessels, that inflammation was a major factor here. And we were looking at nutritional interventions and how they had anti-inflammatory properties as a pathway to reducing blood pressure. But as I moved from cardiovascular medicine into respiratory medicine, we could see the same paradigm shift occurring. The role of inflammation. When I was a medical student, I was taught about asthma as purely a mechanical condition. But as our understanding shifted, so did management. We started to think about this as more a matter of trying to control the inflammation. And in the 1980s, there was also the birth of another important movement which I became involved with as my career unfolded, and that was the poorly named DOHAD hypothesis, the developmental origins of health and disease. This idea, which actually had its origins in the 1960s but was neglected, that was René de Bos's work. But Barker and colleagues in the UK really promoted the idea that the early life environment influenced your lifelong risk of non-communicable diseases, even conditions that may not be manifest until later in life, such as Alzheimer's, such as cardiovascular diseases. And the initial focus was on risk factors such as maternal nutrition in pregnancy, but that was subsequently extended to many of the other environmental risk factors we heard about earlier. And over the years, we've now understood the epigenetic basis for this early programming that Jeff has just really summarised beautifully. This, through the 1990s, was extended from its initial focus on cardiometabolic conditions to other conditions, asthma, COPD, and of course neurodevelopmental problems and mental health, which I'll talk about later. But at this time, there was still very little consideration of inflammation in that early programming. And that was really how I made my contribution to the field. In 1995, I began the first longitudinal study of immune development, which showed pre-symptomatic differences in the trajectory of allergic and non-allergic children. Allergy, of course, being one of the early onset NCDs. And we showed that there were already altered immune profiles present in cord blood at birth, telling us, of course, that this early programming was beginning in utero. And with the epidemic rise in allergies, it was very clear that this was environmental rather than genetic. And we and others in the subsequent years have done multiple studies showing how maternal exposures influence fetal immune development, ranging from toxins, smoking, stress, obesity, microbial exposure, nutrition, and the evidence that these exposures were already beginning to have their effects on the immune system at birth, including epigenetic differences. And this has significance for all aspects of development because the immune system is so critical for all organ systems, including the brain, as I'll come back to in a moment. And we also started to see that the antecedents of so-called adult non-communicable diseases, such as cardiovascular disease, were already evident in children. So middle school children in Western Australia, where I'm from, were already showing, 30% of them, evidence of inflammatory cardiometabolic markers, which of course we know predict the risk of later onset conditions. So our propensity for inflammation as adults is programmed to an extent in early life. There's obviously still some plasticity, but this is a very significant program for time for programming the immune system with lifelong implications. And many early life factors influence that propensity for inflammation, which we might measure as adult baseline CRP, ranging from socioeconomic status, low birth weight, breastfeeding, pollutants, and, as I mentioned before, biodiversity exposure. And one of the most significant factors that we've been hearing about today, because it's almost a conduit for all of the other things, is these patterns of early microbial exposure, because that's influenced by toxins, it's influenced by diet, it's influenced by stress and everything else. And I wanted to share with you this model that was developed by a biological anthropologist, Thomas McDade. And he talked about not just the environmental exposure patterns and the level of inflammation, but the dynamics of inflammation in early life. Because we know that in high microbial environments where the immune system adapted, there are plenty of inflammatory exposures early in life. But that also leads to efficient regulatory processes which dampen down, mature those processes. So the epidemiology then shows that the subsequent long-term effects are a lower baseline CRP, and we see that in developing countries. In contrast, more hygienic environments or areas where there is less biodiversity and less inflammatory, acute inflammatory insults, microbial insults in early life, there is less efficient regulation of inflammation. And in his model, the result is that there is a higher baseline CRP and higher or more sustained responses and poor regulation of these responses in adulthood. And he's done a number of studies to show data that supports this. Now, given our interest in utero, we were quite fascinated to see how this would apply, comparing traditional environments like Papua New Guinea, which is just north of us, and Perth-born babies. So we looked in cord blood. And we wanted to see whether there were differences in baseline levels of activation and also their responses to inflammatory stimuli. And it was quite interesting that the Australian-born newborns had enhanced antigen processing and proliferation and much greater upregulation of their activation markers compared to the Papua New Guinea-born babies. And you can see the very different kind of environment that those babies were born in. And when they were activated, though, they were much less responsive. Now, there could be lots of different environmental reasons for this, but clearly there are differences in utero already emerging, suggesting that we are seeing a myriad of environmental differences that are starting to affect how that baby emerges and the patterns of responses that they may have when in the postnatal period. So just to summarise that, disease prevention requires a developmental and transgenerational ecological approach which considers how the maladaptive global environments and systems contribute to maternal risk factors such as stress, obesity, inflammation and dysbiosis during critical windows of fetal development. And I'm so glad that somebody else has mentioned this and I don't have to go into this, but I'm very concerned about the effects of ultra-processed foods, the dangerous diets that we have. These are a notable risk factor for intestinal permeability, dysbiosis and inflammation. But I wanted this to be on the agenda, so I put it there, because these do propagate neuroinflammation. We know the excitotoxins in the short term have effects on anxiety and mood, and we have no idea what this is doing to the next generation and our children. So I think this is a really important area that we need to give more attention to. So I want to dive even deeper into the implications for neuroimmune disorders, and then at the end I'm going to come right back out and talk about planetary health again. So as an immunologist, we're really interested in the interactions between the immune system and the brain, and we've already heard that the various mechanisms of this. The immune system is a major sensory system. It's a repository of our memory, our immune memory specifically. It mediates its stress, and of course the microglia in the brain are critical for immune surveillance. And the microglia are particularly important during the development of the central nervous system. They enter during embryonic life and comprise about 20% of all of the cells in the brain. They constitutively release cytokines, and they are very sensitive to environmental conditions and play a really important role in the development of our neural networks and synaptic connections. These are contributing, as I said, to the differentiation, to cell survival, migration of neurons, and the development of our synaptic networks. It's a very delicate balance. So early life inflammation has the potential to interfere with all of those things. And it may be, like everything else, a matter of timing and a matter of degree. We already know that significant early inflammatory insults have profound effects, which are visible at birth. But more subtle inflammatory insults may lead to delayed, later risk of neurological diseases, many of which we've been talking about already today. And we certainly see some associations in humans between low-grade inflammation and future susceptibility. Inflammation in utero has been linked to a number of developmental conditions, including autism, and early infections with schizophrenia, as you all know. So this early activation may be establishing a primed phenotype that contributes to long-term issues with resilience and dysregulation. these cytokines, IL-1 beta, is not inherently bad. It's actually essential for learning and memory, but too much or too little is the issue. So a matter of balance yet again. And we know that if we have an excess of this, it does impair memory and synaptic function. And we see many of the inflammatory diseases we've been talking about associated with exaggerated IL-1 beta responses. Cytokines, of course, are really significant in our behaviour. And it's usually not the insult that's affecting our behaviour, but the immune response to it. It's part of our normal sickness behaviours, which is adaptive. But we see similar poorly regulated responses in many neuropsychiatric conditions. And again, I come back to the new concerns that I have, and many have, around the role of ultra-processed foods and inflammatory cytotoxins in this context. So we can learn something from human post-mortem studies, although they are somewhat difficult to interpret. But loosely speaking, there are differences in the cytokine levels, gene expression levels in these scenarios. But the animal studies can be more revealing, and we know that early life inflammation can actually alter, again, the dynamics of microglial responses later in life. Infection in early life alters adult inflammatory insults with exaggerated IL-1 beta responses, altered stress responses, and associated changes in behaviour and learning. And this could be consistent with the two-hit hypothesis of schizophrenia. So how do the microglia regulate long-term effects on the brain? Microglia are crucial for synaptic pruning and refining of these networks, and this is essential for our developmental plasticity. During this early fetal period, there is an enormous synaptic exuberance, if you like, but we lose about 50% of these connections by adulthood. And it's a highly dynamic process of refinement, which is determined or influenced by sensory input and by early environmental exposures and experiences. And we can see visibly these neuronal axons extending and retracting over a matter of hours and minutes in response to local cytokines and growth factors. And it's the microglia that eradicate the suboptimal connections. And this is a complement-mediated process. It is the LPS binding protein tags non-functional synapses for phagocytosis. So if these processes are occurring abnormally, there seems to be a greater predisposition for mental disorders. And there is evidence, again, from animal models that early life stress can alter these pathways. So more evidence, and there's obviously still a lot we don't know, but that early events can have long-term effects on our synaptic patterns through immune pathways. So our early experience is very important. We know that a stimulating early environment increases the complexity of our cortical connections, and deprivation has the opposite effects. And this is consistent with the human story. We know that long-term emotional and physical adversity in childhood has effects on mental health, inflammatory responses in adulthood, and affects our grey matter volume in certain areas of the brain. And these effects can be quite similar whether it's neglect or even without overt abuse. These populations are also at greater risk of many non-communicable diseases. So this is really an issue of social justice. So nurturing and love are really important here. They can literally change gene expression in the neonatal hippocampus and have long-term behavioural effects, influence stress responses, and there are all sorts of measures in humans that show associations with cortisol, IL-6 and saliva and so forth in association with emotional and family stress. And this comes back to the work that Jeff actually spoke to about earlier from Michael Meany, looking at how nurturing, in neonatal experience of nurturing, can influence gene expression and epigenetic regulation in the brain. He showed that the offspring of low nurturing mothers have differential methylation, and that this persists into adulthood with changes in the adult HPA stress responses and cytokine regulation, and that this was not an inherited effect because cross-fostering showed that it was a direct experiential effect. So why might this be happening? Potentially early experiences like this are an evolutionary mechanism to prepare for a hostile environment. But the critical point is that these experiences of the environment can have a lasting effect on our regulation and behaviour. So factors that influence early immune function are therefore implicated in brain development. We see a very intimate relationship between the immune system and the nervous system, and both systems are much more vulnerable to environmental influences during development. Particularly, I come back to microbial ecosystems, our personal and our environmental ecosystems, as one of the most important determinants of early health and immune maturation, and the likely role of dysbiosis and declining microbial diversity in the growing susceptibility to mental ill health. And we really see more and more evidence of this connection we've been talking about all day between the gut and the brain, the neural, the hormonal, the metabolic, the immune signalling, and all of these are influenced by our gut microbiota. And perhaps the clinching studies that were done in animals way back in the early 2000s were those by Pseudo and et al., who showed that in germ-free developmental models, that animals that did not have normal exposure to microbes not only had abnormal immune development, but they also had abnormal stress responses and altered gene expression in the brain. And importantly, we talk about ongoing plasticity, but an important message here is that there are still critical windows during which, or after which I should say, that the effects could not be reversed. So definitely we have some plasticity, but we need to have much more responsibility for the conditions that we provide for the next generations. Even in mature animals, of course, we know that disrupting the gut flora can alter behaviour as well. So just to summarise that part of my talk, we've really got quite a lot of evidence now. There are intimate relationships between the immune system and the brain and neural development, that early events may influence future risks through immune effects, and that intestinal dysbiosis is perhaps previously unrecognised significant contributor to neurodevelopmental and psychiatric conditions. So any strategies to improve immune health are likely to improve brain development and mental health if we can reduce the risk of inflammation. So tying all of that developmental origins picture together, we can see in our modern pro-inflammatory environment that this is having effects on early programming of many systems that can last a lifetime. That early factors which influence our immune and metabolic programming will increase our risk for the early onset non-communicable disease. You see at the top there, the early onset allergies, which can appear within weeks of life, neurocognitive conditions, childhood obesity, and so on. But this ongoing exposure to these pro-inflammatory environments increases our vulnerability to ongoing adversity and our risk of progression and chronicity that leads to the many late effects that we see. So it's important that we see the interface with the environment in these long-term effects. And as Jeff has also mentioned, the transgenerational epigenetic inherited risk that we're passing from generation to generation as well. So now I want to zoom out again and think about the importance of integrated solutions and the need for a much more connected planetary consciousness. If we look at the common threads of all of our challenges, it comes back to broken relationships. And that is our connection to nature, our connection to others, and even to ourselves. It really is a crisis of relationship on every level. So restoring relationships, again at every scale, is going to be a vital part of healing for people, places, and planet, and we certainly need that right now. Solutions will therefore depend on awareness of the interdependence and connectivity, and this is really necessary for intentional change. Our personal sense of relationship to self, others, and the natural world is key, and encouraging that in others is really important, especially in children. We must have much deeper exploration of the human condition. This is essential and must be central in our quest for solutions from personal to the planetary scale, and we need to normalise discussions like this in the mainstream discourse. So many of our modern challenges ultimately stem from within, from the human attitudes, the values and the behaviours that define our increasingly destructive relationship with ourselves and others, and our extractive and exploitative relationship with the natural world. And I really like to return to this quote. I think I probably used it last time I was here, from Gus Speth, Yale professor, former environmental lawyer. I used to think that the top environmental problems were biodiversity loss, ecosystems collapse, and climate change, and that good science could address these. I was wrong. The top environmental problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy. And to deal with these, we need a cultural and spiritual transformation. And this is powerful. This calls for solutions that promote wisdom, awareness, and connectedness. A paradigm shift to more mutualistic worldviews and a higher level of planetary consciousness. In most societies, there's been a progressive shift towards extrinsic life goals, such as material wealth. And across the 20th century, we've seen this huge rise in consumerism with much greater value given to extrinsic goals such as power, fame, and fortune. And this has been at the expense of intrinsic goals such as personal growth, learning, loving, giving, and caring for others. And this has been associated with measurable social trends towards greed, towards unhappiness, distrust, narcissism, antisocial behaviour, isolation, anxiety, mental ill health, and disconnection from nature. But we know that we cannot achieve happiness in its true sense if we don't achieve the intrinsic goals. That achieving extrinsic goals alone does not lead to happiness, it only leads to an unfulfilling cycle of wanting. We know that happiness and meaning in life depend on these intrinsic goals, which are scientifically, in scientific terms I should say, necessary and sufficient. And this is true across cultures and across ages. These intrinsic life goals are associated with better physical, mental, emotional health and vitality, but they're also of collective benefit. They promote feelings of altruism, pro-social attitudes and pro-environmental attitudes, which all have their origins, again, in childhood. So encouraging intrinsic values is a pathway to both enhance personal growth and well-being and to build more pro-social communities. And promoting altruism and these sorts of environmental attitudes in children can have lifelong benefits and effects. We know from psychological models, such as self-determination theory, that there is a strong focus on connection. And this is for achieving purpose and meaning in life, but that's largely focused on connection to self and connection to others, and I'm sure that you're all very familiar with this. But we can also extend that to connection to the natural world. But we need to move beyond the intellectual models to have the deeper experience of connectedness, that universal sense of being part of all things, feeling the awe, the wonder, and the love for the universe around us and within us. And from that deeper, wiser, inspired vantage point, we can approach all of our challenges with a very different perspective. And sometimes it's said this is the longest journey, the journey from the head to the heart. But that is a journey that we really need to take to bring our whole selves to these great challenges. And this is why nature, spiritual practices, storytelling and art and other creative practices are so important for opening that door. And that's why I use art in all of my communications. It also emphasises the importance of nurturing that emotional intelligence, creativity and connection to nature from a very early age when the scene is set not only for our future health behaviours but also our attitudes and behaviours to others and the environment. Children are hungry for mystery and they're wired for awe. So encouraging this is so important if we want to have more generous, connected communities in the future. And I'm really fortunate to be leading the Constellation project. This is part of the Planetary Health Alliance. It was established by Sam Meyer at Harvard to really promote the importance of positive narratives in planetary health and to really counteract the overwhelmingly negative narratives promoting fear, anxiety, disengagement, hopelessness and polarisations, because if we are the storytellers of our generation, it's just irresponsible for us to be nurturing our children with such negative stories of hopelessness. So it really is a wonderful initiative. And that brings us back to one of the greatest moments of awe for all of humanity, which is when we first saw our home from space in 1968. This remarkable outward journey had the even more profound effect of turning our awareness inward to our own condition and that of our troubled planet. And it contributed to this emerging social spiritual movement that inspired Earth Day and the calls for peace, unity, love, justice for people, places and planet. Unfortunately, since then, we have drifted away from that spiritual call and we've become far more focused on intellectual and technical solutions, which are clearly essential, but often they too can be driven by profit rather than the greater good. It is vital that we redefine progress and growth in more meaningful ways and recognise that not all innovation is an improvement, and that technology, although it's a vital part of the solutions, must be applied with more mutualistic value systems as a compass. And to quote Renee DeBoz, lest we end up with a jumble of technologies and counter-technologies that smother body and soul. But we are beginning to remember and realise that our broken relationships are not just an intellectual problem. That despite the chaos and confusion in the world, or even because of it, there is a growing desire for reconnection, for spiritual reawakening. And this brings us back to where we need to begin, to widen our vision and truly feel connected. And that is, again, we need to look within. And there are now global movements, the Inner Development Goals, which are becoming a really important strategy for trying to address the Sustainable Development Goals. And really looking at the inner assets we need to make these changes. So the big question for all of us is what do we do? And I'm not going to go through all of this, but many have already talked about restoring the balance to try and buffer the negative effects, promoting the positive nature-based solutions, rewilding traditional foods, physicality, biodiversity and positive emotions and mindfulness, and to try and reduce some of the negative and erosive aspects of dysbiosis on the other side of the equation, all from the first moments of life. But my personal offering to this question of what we do is that we should not underestimate the importance and the power of kindness and love in our doing and in our being. kindness for everything, every person, and especially for ourselves. Kindness builds connectedness, meaning and purpose, and it encourages or even requires us to look within and bring us to that place of meaningful service to something greater. And of course, we all know the positive effects that has for our well-being, mind, body, spirit. And this is what planetary health is all about. When we see people for who they really are, it can help us know who we really are, and that applies individually and also collectively. Kindness is powerful, it's contagious, and we certainly need more of it in the world today. So I've really tried to take you on a journey from the cellular to the planetary scale and consider why we need to think about health in all ways as a connection between the person, the place, and the planet. And we need to normalise academic discussions about meaning and consciousness as part of the solutions, because it is essential that we have hope, engagement, and the inspiration if we hope to achieve change in our troubled world today. So I do invite you to join our conversations of connectivity. Some of you may have received our emails already through Jeff. And this is really, we try to curate events like you do to explore all aspects of health for people, places and planet. We have a Nova network, we have a Nova integration hub, and you're very welcome to join us. And I'll just end by inviting you to our conference, which will be in December 7 and 8. It's a virtual conference, it's free, and we're going to be looking at the seeds of change, inspiring a better future. So please feel free to contact me, and I just want to thank you again, Jeff, for your vision in this space and this opportunity to share with you today. Thank you.